democracy will prevail.
Margaret Thatcher was determined to put the great back into Britain. But in seeking to change the country, she also provoked intense hostility. Where previous governments had divided national opinion before, this time it was personal. The ire of those who opposed her policies seemed directed at Mrs. Thatcher and her alone. From brutal acts of terrorism to urban riots, civil disobedience, to ministerial dissent, throughout it all, the Prime Minister appeared unmoved. With so much to get done, she had little time to doubt her own convictions. But did her will ever waver? And did events ever influence or change the direction of her government? Each and every British Prime Minister must attend to the issue of Northern Ireland. For Mrs. Thatcher, the gravity of the problem was forcibly brought home by events surrounding her election in 1979. At the start of the election campaign, her right-hand man and unionist sympathiser, Éire Niamh, was assassinated by the IRA. His murder was followed 5 months later by that of Lord Mountbatten, and on the same day by that of 18 soldiers at Warrenpoint, close to the border with the Irish Republic.
I think that Margaret Thatcher was appalled by Warrenpoint, by the killings in Ireland, by the ferocity of it all. I don't think she ever really brought herself to sympathise about the Irish problem with anybody. She just saw British soldiers being killed, she saw a lot of taxpayers' money being spent, and she just wanted the situation to resolve itself.
On election, Mrs. Thatcher took her first tentative steps into Northern Irish politics with attempts to get all-party talks moving at Stormont.
She was a unionist. She would like Northern Ireland to stay part of the Union, but she didn't really sympathise particularly with the Unionists, politicians. She was mainly and overwhelmingly concerned with the burden of different kinds on the rest of Britain.
Initial progress was frustrated, and Northern Ireland slipped down the political agenda. But in late 1980 and early 1981, 2 hunger strikes in the Maze prison in Belfast forced the province back into the spotlight. The hunger strikes were part of a campaign by IRA prisoners inside the jail to regain their special status and be recognised as political prisoners.
Her memoirs do record that while she certainly didn't admire their cause, she did have some regard for the courage of people who were perfectly prepared to starve themselves to death. But it was terrorism by another means, and the whole objective was to force the government to concede. And if Margaret Thatcher had conceded, the government would have been on the run, they would have felt. It wouldn't have stopped terrorism, it would have intensified it.
Bobby Sands MP! Bobby Sands MP! Bobby Sands MP!
The second strike began in March. It was led by the IRA leader in the Maze, Bobby Sands. 2 months later, he died, provoking outrage in the nationalist community.
Within minutes of Bobby Sands dying, crowds of up to 1,000 were gathering all around Republican Belfast. Petrol bombs were hurled at the security forces in large numbers, along with rocks and acid bombs as the barricades went up.
In her memoirs, Mrs. Thatcher refers to this period as the beginning of the time of troubles. The death of Bobby Sands, together with 10 other prisoners, probably recruited more Republicans to the cause of violence and, on a political level, contributed to the strength of Sinn Féin at the expense of the non-violent nationalist party, the SDLP. It certainly led to an upsurge in bombings on the mainland. Mrs. Thatcher, too, became the IRA's top target for assassination.
Look, if you're fighting the IRA, they're going to get you if they can. You've got to be very well protected. And I think Mrs. Thatcher just accepted that that came with the job.
The IRA wasn't the only source of unrest. While petrol bombs were being thrown in Belfast, rioting erupted on the mainland, beginning in Brixton, South London, in April 1981. The violence and disorder were later said to be on a scale not previously seen in this century in Britain.
Several of the rioters last night, like this one, have been white, and it's clear that the feelings are directed not against whites as such, but against the police.
Home Secretary William Whitelaw immediately commissioned a senior judge, Lord Scarman, to report on the riots, their cause, and how further rioting might be prevented.
Community relations officers in these areas have been working very hard to establish better relations, and it seemed that was the right way of going, in the hope that it would succeed.
The inquiry was widened in July when other riots occurred in Southall, West London, Toxteth in Liverpool, and Moss Side in Manchester.
Let me tell you, if anybody attack you, police will caught the man within a 24 hours. But anybody, if he's attacked any Asians, even 6 months, they can't afford to arrest that man.
Well, I don't accept that, and you know, this is an allegation that's made not only from that area, from other parts of London, and we refute it.
The opposition Labour Party were quick to lay blame for the riots at the door of Margaret Thatcher's economic policies.
The nature of the economic crisis inflicted on many parts of Britain and many parts of the major cities gave a sort of excuse to elements amongst disaffected youth to resort to violence. That doesn't offer any justification for what occurred. There isn't any. But there are reasons.
Mrs. Thatcher was having none of it. Unemployment could never explain or excuse the riots. The government's fiscal policy was not indicted, and neither would it change. Instead, the police would in future be equipped with better riot control equipment.
These were not economic riots. They were social unrest, they were racial antagonisms. There were all kinds of worries of a depressed community, but depression going far wider than anything which was purely economic.
Attempts to make progress in Ireland continued. In late 1981, Jim Pryor became Northern Ireland Secretary. Pryor proposed a form of rolling devolution for the province, whereby a local assembly might evolve from small beginnings into a forum of genuinely devolved power sharing.
The Unionists were divided. Paisley wanted devolution because Paisley wanted to be in power in Northern Ireland. But a lot of the Unionists, including Enoch Powell, who had a considerable influence over Margaret Thatcher, didn't want devolution. They wanted integration. They wanted the difference between Northern Ireland and the rest of us in the UK to be abolished, as it were, so that Northern Ireland was just the same as Worcestershire or Lancashire.
The violence and killings continued both in Northern Ireland and on the mainland. On the 20th of July 1982, IRA terrorists struck in London, first in Hyde Park, killing 2, and later in Regent's Park, killing 6.
What was the scene, as you could see, when you got near where the explosion had happened?
Carnage. Carnage, sheer carnage. Terrible, terrible.
Mrs. Thatcher visited the wounded the following day.
They're all marvellously brave, and in spite of their injuries, wonderfully cheerful. They really are an example to us. And the total faith between them and the nursing staff and doctors is wonderful. And the nursing staff, they told me they just worked on and on and on until everything they could do had been done. Our anger at those who did this, of course, is total. They're just barbaric and vicious, the people who did this. But they mustn't win.
The atrocities did not derail the work of government, and so, as planned on the 23rd of July, the Northern Ireland Act, which established the rules for a devolved assembly, became law. Gradually,
under Jim Pryor, then under me and so on, we got, of course with the Prime Minister's consent, a negotiation going with the Irish Republic. She was keen on that because she wanted the Irish police, the Gardaí and the Irish Army to help on the military, on the security side. And she was content to give the Irish a certain amount, not too much, not joint rule, but a certain amount of leeway in return for that cooperation. That was the bargain as she saw it. Terrorism and riots presented problems for the government and for the police. But an altogether different challenge to authority came from a group of women and their supporters who set up camp outside Greenham Common Air Base in Berkshire. It became a very powerful symbol of dissent.